Hi everyone, today I'll be breaking down a hand played by Matt Berkey, founder and lead instructor of the training site Solve for Why. Berkey has a reputation for being more of an exploitative player as opposed to a theoretical one, but in this video, we are going to see a different side of him. The hand was played in a private 2550 game that Berkey was streaming and starts off completely standard with a raise and a call, and Berkey squeezing with ace-jack suited from the small blind. He gets 4-bet by the initial aggressor and makes the call. The flop comes ace-6-5 with a flush draw, and that's when things start to get interesting. If you've been playing poker for a while, chances are you've heard the phrase, check to the raiser. It's good advice for a reason. As the pre-flop caller, we are missing the very strongest hands like aces and kings, since we would likely have put in a re-raise with them. This gives us an equity disadvantage on most flops and makes us want to play more defensively. Having an equity disadvantage is a bit like being a man down in a football match. We simply don't have the numbers to make a direct attack work. Instead, we want to be patient and wait for our opponent to make the first move. If he does nothing, the game ends in a draw, which is a good result for us. If he wants to attack, he needs to commit players to it, which at least gives us some counter chances in the event that his attack fails. Of course, there are some exceptions where the flop is so good for the caller's range that he actually wants to lead at some frequency. But these situations are so rare that it's generally not worth trying to study them unless you've got the rest of your game worked out. And this is why leading the flop is often referred to as donk betting. The vast majority of donk bets are made by weaker players, or donkeys, who don't understand how ranges interact. Coming back to the hand, Berkey decides to lead the flop for a quarter of the pot. And at first glance, this definitely doesn't seem like one of the exceptions I was talking about. If anything, we would expect ace-high boards to magnify the pre-flop raiser's advantage, not diminish it. This is because the 4-better has plenty of hands that connect with the ace, such as aces and ace-king. He also has some weaker ace-x that was 4-betting as a bluff, but has now hit a decent hand in the form of top pair. All of this gives the 4-better a big equity advantage on ace-high boards, more than 60% in some cases. To put things into perspective, having 60% equity is like being up against a football team that is not just one man down, but two. The caller is essentially crippled and should in principle be playing a very passive strategy. But when we look at GTO frequencies, we find that there is a surprising amount of leading on ace-high boards. On ace-6-5 for example, the caller is leading 26% of the time, despite only having 37% equity. And ace-jack, Berkey's exact holding, does in fact prefer to bet, even though it weakens his checking range in a situation where he can hardly afford it. Why? The answer lies in how the equities are distributed. Despite being a big underdog in terms of equity, the caller's range is very polarized on ace-6-5. This is a fancy way of saying that it consists mostly of nuts or air, with very few hands that are in between. Let's take a closer look at the caller's equity map. Notice how any ace or better appears in green, and anything worse than an ace appears in red. If there were any hands with middling equity, they would appear in yellow, but as you can see, there just aren't that many of them. This allows the caller to play his strong hands much more aggressively, since they don't have to worry about helping any middling hands get to showdown. Going along with our football analogy, imagine if we changed the rules of the game such that we only had to score a single goal to win, and any goals that our opponent scored would be disallowed. The best strategy would now be a very aggressive one where we go all out to attack our opponent. And this would be true no matter how many men we were down. Our opponent is going to be 100% focused on defense, so any men we allocate to our own defense would just be a waste of resources. Even our goalkeeper should be up there joining the attack. And this is what having a polarized range does for us. No matter how big our equity disadvantage is, we still want to be very aggressive because there is nothing to be gained from playing defensively. If we replace the 6 with a king, however, we see that the caller starts to check his entire range once again. This is because the king introduces a bunch of marginal hands like king-queen and king-jack suited in his range. It also devalues his ace-x hands, since a big part of the 4-better's range is pocket kings, a hand that has now improved to a set. This difference is reflected in the equity map. The caller's range is no longer as polarized as before, with a distinct region of 1-pair hands that shows up as yellow. These hands have between 30 to 60% equity, and for the most part, just want to get to showdown. Here, checking our strong hands actually serves a purpose. It prevents our opponent from playing too aggressively when we check and takes a bit of pressure off our marginal hands. As a side note, there also tends to be less leading as stacks get deeper. One of the reasons why our range was so polarized on a6-5 was the fact that any ace was strong enough to stack off. At 250 blinds deep, this is no longer true. Hands like ace-queen and ace-jack clearly belong in the marginal category, since we can't just pile money in and expect to get called by worse. And just like any other situation where we have a region of marginal hands, we need to check some strong hands in order to help them get to showdown. Personally, I was really impressed by Berkey's decision to lead the flop. On such a disadvantageous board, most players would just check their entire range without a second thought. And yet Berkey realized almost immediately that leading was an option. It doesn't necessarily make him a GTO wizard, but it definitely shows that he understands the situation on some level. But I think the greater lesson here is that while conventional wisdom might be useful in the majority of situations, at some point in our poker progression, they become more of a hindrance than a help. If there is one thing Berkey is known for, it is his refusal to be boxed in by convention. Sure, this sometimes leads to him making spewy plays, but there are also situations like this where it allows him to eke out that extra bit of EV compared to his peers. And that is something we should all be striving to do.